It's 1959, and with the beginning of the year, scientists bring great news to the administrators. The TAN-7, our new radiation mapping satellite, has returned well over 75% of the possible scientific readings to teams on the ground. This marks the end of its mission and the beginning of a new chapter for the Aurora Space Program. The RP-1 becomes a fixture of the program going forward, and plans are already being laid out to visit the moon before the end of the decade. The administrator, Satish Dhawan, just needs to sell his plan to the United States Congress or another backer. However, no backer can forward the amount of funding required, and the moon dream of Dhawan is laughed out of Congress, as most of the members believe the lead over the Soviet Union is secure after we beat them by over a year to orbit. Thus, there is no further reason for scientific parlor tricks when the United States is so much more technologically advanced than the USSR. The government, however, takes very seriously the capabilities of the new RP-1 as a missile platform and takes partial control over the ASP and orders the program to develop further heavy lift variants of the RP launch vehicle. Just as the days of university payloads being lifted into space seem to be fading into the past, soon to be overtaken by military control and government oversight, Satish made a compromise with United States officials. The ASP would be given two contracts, one to launch scientific payloads to observe the local space around Earth and to test critical hardware for new military programs. This would require further development of the RP launch vehicles to achieve these goals, and two, to launch early communications networks and navigation satellite arrays sponsored 50-50 by the United States government and a military contractor called NAVCOM. While this didn't meet the desires of Dhawan's original goal, it kept the dream alive of a scientific and independent space program funded by private contracts or public grants. While all of this was underway, Stacy Wood undertook a flight in the X-4DT on January 22nd in an attempt to best the 120-kilometer altitude record he set just last year. Government officials cracking down on the Aurora Space Program, after what has been seen as a general lack of oversight, want to confirm this previous record in their own books, and they put Stacy to work. The government sees Ernest and Stacy as assets on loan from the military to the side project that is the Aurora Space Program, and as such wants to ensure that they are being properly utilized. Additionally, the military has requested that their pilots be returned as soon as possible, giving the Aurora Space Program a year's time to complete the X-plane program before all funding is pulled. Unfortunately, they have also requested that Gwen is grounded for all flights until the contracts of Ernest and Stacy are up. Administrators are really beginning to question if they work for the Americans or for the Russians, but for now, such whispers are kept hushed. Stacy starts to descend into the atmosphere after reaching the peak altitude, and his record attempt was unfortunately not successful. No new record forthcoming. In response, the administrators put another request in for an attempt by Stacy in the X-4 later this year. And just as that request was finalized, the XLR-99 was finally finished, and work would begin on the X-5 it would be built around. The XLR-99 would propel the X-plane program to previously unheard of speeds and round out the research being done on fuselage construction and material science. All of this data would be used in upcoming flights of the new Air Force hardware and planes. Stacy does make sure to remember that after he lands, he must speak to Gwen about these latest developments and console her for being unable to fly for the rest of the year. The Aurora Space Program had been building boosters since last year's end, and the first new RP-1 booster rolled off of the assembly bay in early March. NAVCOM would select this booster to be the first vehicle for its navigation satellite, NavSat-1, fixing it up to the upper stage in the payload bay just after the Karuk's completion. Navsat-1 would be an early test satellite to demonstrate capabilities of navigational satellites to coordinate military movements. The satellite would be lofted into a 350-kilometer circular orbit at approximately 60 degrees of inclination. This would give it enough coverage to be able to assist with unit tracking in latitudes as high as Central Europe for a few hours of time each day. It would also be yet another certification of the Karuk-1's lift capabilities. At present, the ASP engineers believe that the Karuk-1 is capable of lifting approximately 1 ton to low Earth orbit, and while that wouldn't be required on this mission, the Ahote 600 certainly would not have been able to perform this task and execute the orbital insertion as precisely as the current launch vehicle is capable of doing. In light of this, the engineers put a fast track on further refinement of the design and tooling of all the tanks for the booster, so new ones could be produced quicker than before. The second stage would continue to perform nominally on the Navsat-1 as it had with the TAN-7, relieving fears of a potential next stage curse, as the assembly line engineers had begun calling it. The Ahote 600 had often seen failures in its upper stage in relation to the AJ-10 engine that was used, and it would seem that luck was on the side of the program, as all 4 of the second stage AJ-10s would perform well within operating parameters. However, some engineers still believe that the 4 AJ-10s on the second stage was simply a recipe for disaster, as sooner or later one would inevitably fail and send the complete stage careening out of orbit. In total, with all 4 engines, the stage has only an 85% chance of success, leaving a clear 15% left over in the possibility of failure. This was simply too much for most engineers. However, some folks would still believe the current design would continue to be able to fly until a solution could be found. The final stage also used an AJ-10, but this would only be one point of failure. That has an ignition chance around 96%, and this calmed the fears of disaster. But unfortunately, this is spaceflight, and some risks would need to be taken. Luckily, this time all went well, and Navsat-1 was hoisted into its orbit, beginning its mission for the government and for Navcom. Around 1 month later, Stacy would be thrust once again into the cockpit of the X-4 and ordered to reach 120 kilometers in the rocket plane. Stacy would attempt this, but he knows the act of reaching 120 kilometers of altitude was a balancing act of pressures on the airframe, lift generated by the wings, and a rationing of delta V that was previously unheard of. His first flight was a perfect balance of all of these by chance, and he would be unlikely to repeat the feat. The government would simply just have to take the Aurora Space Program at face value in this situation, and as Stacy careened towards the Kármán line, just as he had done on previous missions, he would adjust the plane to a re-entry attitude, preparing to pull off the belly flop maneuver. Unfortunately, upon re-entry, he would overshoot the runway by about 20 kilometers and would have to bank around to return towards the Space Center. Pressure would rise on the tiny wings until they burst from their attachment points and flew off into the airstream. Stacy, determined to recover the craft, would make some hasty maneuvers to try and slow down towards parachute deployment speeds. And upon deployment of the parachute, the landing gear were dropped, and Stacy would prepare to touch down, leaving the plane soon after to drop to the surface on its own in the event of a high-speed impact. This quick thinking heralded Stacy as something of a hero in the Aurora Space Program, as he recovered valuable flight hardware and saved the Aurora Space Program a lot of funding just as the budget was tightening. On July 1st, one of the first scientific missions that was scheduled to take place since the reorganization of the Aurora Space Program would take place. This mission, the TAN-8F, was originally planned as a film return mission in order to test the possibility of returning scientific data and photographic film to the surface after an extended orbital period. Unfortunately, due to budget cuts and limits on the technology available to the Aurora Space Program, the administration chose to create a proof-of-concept return capsule with the goal of reaching approximately 80 to 90% of orbital velocity, then reorienting itself to return safely towards the surface. The craft would consist of a small cone-shaped probe and a core underneath a parachute. This would all be on top of a disk of pure beryllium, and the complete stack was designated as the capsule module. Beneath this was the propulsion pack, or the service module, which contained cold gas nitrogen thrusters and a small solid rocket motor for separating the craft from the second stage of the RP-1. These thrusters would be used to maintain orientation prior to re-entry so that the capsule module came down on the beryllium shield first. The plans for this mission's original goal of film return would be pushed on to a later mission, for now designated the TAN-13F, which was far into the future. But for now, the TAN-8F would take its place in the history of the program as our first craft to attempt to return from orbital velocities. Upon separation from the second stage, the small craft would perform a series of maneuvers to reorient itself and prepare for re-entry soon to come. Igniting the solid rocket motor shortly after those maneuvers, it would separate itself from the second stage of the RP-1. Once far enough away from this second stage of the RP-1, the TAN-8F probe would reorient itself back towards its re-entry attitude and prepare for the final stage of its flight. Upon separation of the service module from the capsule module, the TAN-8F would re-enter the atmosphere. Engineers would certainly be on the edges of their seats for this one, as they were unsure if the beryllium shield would be able to handle the high speeds. Of course, it had been tested in a lab, but lab conditions are always a little different from the real deal. Finally, after a fiery re-entry, the TAN-8F would open its parachute and descend gracefully towards the surface of the ocean. The mission, a great success, would pave the way for any future operations from orbit that intended to return towards the surface. Of course, the scientists were very happy with this outcome, and they would seek to utilize the information for future launches and flights. And at last, the final planned mission of the year would take place. This would be the flight of the X-5DT. This plane was a marvel of engineering and a direct evolution of the X-4 that came before it. A larger diameter core tank and a taper towards the nose would be utilized to include as much fuel as possible without lengthening the airframe beyond what was capable of our drop planes. The goal of the X-5's mission would be to reach a hypersonic speed and maintain that for approximately 2 minutes. Engineers determined that the best altitude to do this while still in the atmosphere and generating lift would be approximately 40,000 meters or lower. And to avoid the heating effects of such a hypersonic flight, the altitude would need to be above 29 or more thousand meters in the air. In order to maximize the speed, minimize the drag, maximize the lift, and minimize the heating effects, the altitude was determined that it should be between 37,000 and 39,000 meters in the air. And the XLR-99 would power the plane well beyond that 2,000 meters per second required and would hold that speed for approximately 2 minutes and 30 seconds, well surpassing the requirements of the contract. Unfortunately, this high speed was not something that had been encountered before in the program, and the plane would fly well past the Space Center, far beyond what was possible to recover by a simple banking maneuver. And with the plane going at such high speeds, and with the final mission of the X-4 fresh in everyone's mind, they did not seek to perform such a dreadful maneuver for this first flight of the X-5. Of course, I'm sure Ernest would have been confident in his ability to perform such a pull bank, but it was not to be, and so the X-5 would come down in the ocean just west of Florida, utilizing its new parachute recovery system that would seek to bring the plane down in a much more level capacity. Ernest would jump from the plane and seek to land on the ocean in case of an impact, just as Stacy had done earlier this year. So, with all of that being done and dusted, I would like to say that this episode is a little bit of an interesting one. Here we are in the final part of the episode, and so I'm a little bit off script at this point. I think this is a good time to talk about all the backstage stuff. Well, for this episode, I encountered a bit of a problem. I was stuck in the programs, and for this, the programs for early Earth observation and commercial applications. So I needed a way to explain this and explain why I wasn't doing anything in the proper order. I wanted to try and actually reach the moon by 1959, at least an impactor, since that was when the Soviet Union did it in real life. They did it by September 14th. And I'm still going to use that as the date that the Soviet Union would impact the moon, and they still did in this timeline. Next year, obviously, I think Satish Dhawan will have a little bit of justification for his moon dream, as Congress will get news later this year about the Soviet Union's impactor probe, and they will seek to maybe look towards the moon. Maybe they won't. We'll see. For now, Congress is still set on this low Earth observation program, and it seems like they're more interested in using a space program to develop engines of war rather than develop the scientific capabilities of the nation. And I guess this seems like a bit of an alternate history. Is like, what would the United States have done if it actually if it beat the Soviet Union to orbit? I mean, it's not something that people think about very often, and our scientific exploration was really spurred on by the fact that the Soviet Union beat us to orbit. So you never know what would happen. But if you enjoyed this episode and you enjoy the story that I'm creating, go ahead and leave a like, and I hope to see you in the next episode where we'll see the conclusion of this.